Today, we are taking a look at a new survey from Muck Rack, the State of Journalism 2022. Welcome to Today in News Tech, our weekly extended chat where we discuss the past week of news and break down what we can learn to help our local newspaper publishers at Our Hometown Inc. So Matt, I came across this new survey by a company called Muck Rack. Have you heard of them before?
No, this is actually the first time.
Come across them looking for contact info for reporters and publishers before.
And that's basically one of the things that they are selling is PR management and being able to search, get in contact with, find the right journalists through this whole search engine thing. So I've actually come across this several times in the same manner of just looking up different journalists, and Muck Rack kind of has this database of them, and all their articles that they've published, all their social contacts, all that kind of stuff is all kind of put in one place. And that's basically one of the services that they provide. But as a auxiliary or an ancillary to that, they also touch in with these journalists that they have access to. And they have given us some really good data from their latest survey called the State of Journalism 2022, Social Media Habits, Reporting Strategies, and PR Pitching Preferences, and more. In this case, I just wanted to start because this is pretty lengthy. It's 50 pages of data here. So I thought we would just focus on the first section, which is the social media habits of journalists in 2022. Here's a quick demographic breakdown of those who are actually part of the study: full-time journalists, editorial writers, and bloggers, their experience level, lots of 20 plus years in the industry. So these were some very experienced people to talk to, where they actually disseminate their content and the types of content they covered. This is all kind of part of the survey itself as just a general demographic breakdown of who they were talking to. So social media news consumption and reporting is part one, and we will just start with some of the questions. How has COVID affected your work? I mean, we can basically poll any of our local news customer publishers in how COVID has changed not only how they cover things, but actually what they're covering, what their audiences want to hear about. In addition, they also put a few other stories in here. While COVID does dominate, you still have remote work. A lot of us are doing that. Layoffs, employment things. The takeaway here is the majority of journalists have been affected in some way, which is very obvious and understandable. Even with some of the negative effects of the pandemic, employment, income, inflation, the majority of journalists are still optimistic about their profession. Now, that could come from the fact that they think they're still needed, they see a place for themselves, or possibly that they still see that they can contribute as a role. There's opportunities out there, even with big tech issues, all kinds of other things. They're still optimistic about where things are going. Finally, turning to more of the social aspect, it turns out that many journalists start with other online outlets when they're looking for news to cover. Now, this is basically augmenting whatever kind of hyper-local journalism might be going on, but actually, many times, online outlets, especially Twitter, have a really good handle on hyperlocal as well. So when you look at online newspapers and magazines, that's a very large umbrella. But when you go to Twitter and you start breaking into, are people going to social media to find news stories to pitch to their editors and things like that? Are they going out and seeking other stories that way?
Journalists love Twitter. That's like the most popular social platform personally, but professionally, it just seems like there's a lot of people on there, and they're not just using it as a marketing tool. They're actually doing research on there, which I think is really slick.
That was definitely one of the points I wanted to highlight, was that it's not just getting your news out there, it's seeing what everybody else is doing.
You used it for research, you're targeting, you use it to connect with sources, people that are talking about stuff happening. You just direct message them or you mention them in your tweet to make that connection and get the story.
The next point is what we were just saying. Twitter is the top for journalists, followed by Facebook as where they go for both interaction with other journalists and, of course, interaction with potential audiences. Facebook is in a strong second, and there is one thing about Facebook that differentiates it from Twitter in a very interesting way that I came across in one of my success story articles last week, was that the use of Facebook groups is a very interesting way of hyper targeting small demographics, be it a neighborhood page or a business page that's local, things like that. I was reading a story about a group in Chicago, and they were trying to figure out how their local neighborhood wanted to get their news, and they discovered most of the people that they were running into wanted it through text messaging, not email, because that particular demographic relied much more on text messaging for their day-to-day interactions. So they found that out through basically polling Facebook groups and then actually meeting people and garnering these things. And so Facebook became a very interesting, at least that group feature from Facebook was a very good tool to basically cull together a group of potential audience members in order to kind of find out how they wanted to soft launch. A little bit more on the social, how much time are you spending? All of these things seem to be growing a little bit from year to year. No big changes, but it is kind of showing where things are happening on which social sites. But as we say, Twitter, Facebook, those are still the big ones. This goes to more of the transparency and accountability side of reporting, where in this case, journalists are actually going to the social media presences of the topics or the companies that they're covering to actually see what they've been doing. And that kind of gives them more context for if there's some kind of behavior or a story regarding a certain company and they want to find out more context, they can go to the social media platforms and find out what that company's been doing there as well to either provide extra context or augment their coverage that they're reporting on a certain entity. Let's go find out what they've been doing on social media. So that's yet another use of social media in a research manner of going through things and finding out more about your targets through their social media accounts and presences.
It's an interesting point that, like, I don't know if people are looking at it this way because there's all this attention on fake news, but like part of the journalist's role could be to use Facebook as a potential source. It's like the new public square. They used to have to sort out the real news from the fake news in interviews and normal direct contact with people. Now, they could use these sources on social media, and if they do vet a source, then embedding the original tweet or embedding the Facebook post on your article would be a good way to possibly drive engagement with the story, because then the reader could look at that original tweet and look at the conversation that happened there. And
you make a very good point, because that type of backlinking and intersite linking of different types of news coverage actually affects the SEO appearance of that particular content. So having links between external sites, internal sites, and things like that actually gets more awareness of your content, because basically how the search engine optimization looks at how many citations or links there are, and that actually is what they use as a trust score. The more something gets shared, the more it gets vetted, as you say, the more quote unquote trustworthy it appears to the algorithms.
oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah, that's great background.
And lastly, I did want to basically wrap up this social habits talk with, well, once the journalists have posted this content, they're being very savvy in tracking how well it's doing and then using that kind of performance metric, that kind of data on how well something's performing to then either alter, base, kind of use that to judge how well your content is doing, not only for what you're doing in the past, but what you're going to be doing in the future.
I love this. Anytime you can use metrics, you don't want to get too lost in the numbers because there's a ton of things that you can measure. But measuring engagement on social media and simply page views on your website articles is a great signal to look for. The numbers aren't going to lie. I mean, there are posts that maybe you marketed better than others, but generally, I think looking at what are the results, how many people viewed this, how long did they stay on these articles, should be data that's feeding in a constant feedback loop in terms of tailoring what you cover.
Absolutely.
You got to be listening. That's a great way to listen without asking. You don't have to actually get people to give you feedback. It's right there. Aggregating all your social media stats. Some stories might do better on other platforms. You want to look at total likes, total shares, because most platforms have an equivalent version of both of those. And then you can just kind of sum them all up. This is kind of stuff that we're doing informally on Today in News Tech. Certain stories definitely seem to do better than others. And it's clear on the engagement, usually on Twitter for us.
And one of the things I was thinking about when you're tracking how your posts are doing on social media, the feedback that gives you comes from not only the headline, the tags, when you post, are you posting kind of from a site, or are you doing a native post? There's so many different ways of getting your content on these social media platforms that when large PR firms and stuff do some of the research to kind of help you figure out what's working best for other people, helps you narrow it down a little bit and focus on, let's see how it performs when I share directly from the site. We put a couple of hashtags on there and let's see how that works. That's what I've been doing on Today in News Tech with our social media posting from the site. I can play around with who gets tagged, what kind of hashtags we use, and then see what kind of turnaround that gives us on the effect of how that goes out.
Today in News Tech, the podcast covering innovation in digital journalism. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and subscribe on YouTube or any of your favorite podcast apps. We'll see you tomorrow.
At our hometown, we help newspapers build WordPress websites, design native apps, and develop digital subscription models. If you are interested in a free prototype of your publication on WordPress, go to ourhometown.com and click the Contact Us button.